On the night of March 1st, 2023, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Rockledge, Florida, a call came through to emergency services at approximately 1:30 in the morning. The caller was not a neighbor. He was not a passerby. He was a family friend who had just received a video call from two young boys, ages 6 and 9, their faces glowing in the dim light of a smartphone screen, a dark corridor visible behind them. The boys were calling for help. When the friend arrived at the house on Fisker Boulevard, he found a scene that would haunt investigators for months. 4 people were dead. 2 young children were the only survivors. And the question that would drive the investigation forward was deceptively simple. Why had a family that seemed to be managing its challenges, that had established boundaries and sought to protect its children, become the target of a calculated, brutal attack? This is the story of the Terwilliger family, of a man whose criminal history should have been a roadmap to prevention, and of a system that failed to connect the dots until it was far too late. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Rockledge is one of the older communities in Brevard County, Florida, a town that traces its roots back to the 1880s, when it was little more than a handful of families settling along the Indian River. Over the decades, it grew in tandem with Florida's space industry, benefiting from the proximity to Cape Canaveral, but it never lost its small-town character. The streets are lined with single-family homes, modest but well-kept, and the pace of life is steady. People know their neighbors. Crime, when it happens, is usually minor. This is not a place where families expect violence to reach them. It was in this setting that the Terwilliger family had built their life. At the center of the household was Glenda Terwilliger, 63 years old, a woman whose entire existence revolved around the well-being of her daughter and grandchildren. Glenda had never been one to seek recognition or praise. She was not the kind of person who needed to be in the spotlight, but those who knew her understood that she was the foundation of the family. She managed the daily routines, the school drop-offs, the evening meals, the bedtime rituals. She was the one who made sure the children felt safe, who listened when they had questions, who offered comfort when they were frightened or confused. Her presence was a quiet, stabilizing force, and without it the household would have struggled to function. Her daughter, Constance Terwilliger, was 35 years old at the time of the murders. Constance was a single mother who carried the weight of providing for her family, while simultaneously trying to maintain a sense of normalcy and structure for her children. She worked full-time, managed the household finances, and made decisions about her children's education and health. But what set Constance apart, according to friends and family members who were later interviewed by investigators, was her relationship with her eldest child, Kiara. Constance did not rule by authority alone. She listened. She gave her daughter space to express herself, to voice concerns, to ask difficult questions. This approach had fostered a relationship built on trust, and it was that trust that would become central to the events leading up to the tragedy. Kiara Terwilliger was 15 years old. Friends described her as outgoing, mature beyond her years, and deeply committed to her family. She helped her mother with household tasks, cared for her younger brothers, and took on responsibilities that many teenagers would have resisted. But she was still a teenager, navigating the complexities of adolescence, friendships, school, and the beginning of independence. She had plans. She wanted stability. She wanted a future that felt safe. And she trusted her mother to help her navigate the challenges that came her way. One of those challenges arrived unexpectedly, in the form of Domenico Gigante, her biological father, a man who had been absent from her life for most of her childhood, and who in her teenage years had decided he wanted to reconnect. The 2 younger boys, whose names have been withheld to protect their privacy, were 6 and 9 years old. They were the sons of Michael Watson, Constance's former partner, who remained actively involved in their lives despite the fact that he and Constance were no longer together. Michael was 36 years old, a steady, reliable presence who helped with school pickups, attended parent-teacher conferences, and provided the kind of day-to-day support that allowed the boys to feel secure. His relationship with Constance was no longer romantic, but it was functional, cooperative, and focused entirely on the well-being of the children. For the boys, their world was small and safe. They went to school, they played with friends, They came home to a house where their mother, grandmother, and older sister were always there. Their father checked in regularly. It was a life built on routine, on the comfort of familiar voices and predictable rhythms, and it was a life that, on the surface, seemed insulated from the kind of violence that would soon shatter it. But beneath that surface, a different story was unfolding. Domenico Gigante had not always been absent from Chiara's life by choice. He had been absent because he had not been involved, because he had not provided support, because he had not been present during the years when a father's presence mattered most. And then years later, he had decided to return. He said he wanted to make things right. He said he wanted to be a real father. But what he wanted, as events would reveal, was not reconciliation. It was control. And when that control was denied, when boundaries were set and enforced, when Chiara and her mother refused to allow him to dictate the terms of their relationship, his desire for control transformed into something far more dangerous. Domenico Gigante's reappearance in Chiara's life did not come with advance notice or a gradual reintroduction. It was sudden, insistent, and immediately disruptive. He had not been part of her childhood. He had not attended school events, birthday parties, or family gatherings. He had not contributed financially or emotionally to her upbringing. And yet, when he decided to reconnect, he expected immediate access, immediate trust, and immediate acceptance. Constance Terwilliger understood the complexity of the situation. She knew that Chiara had a biological connection to this man, and she knew that Chiara might at some point want to explore that relationship. But she also knew that trust is not automatic, that the title of father is not a guarantee of good intentions, and that allowing an unknown man into her daughter's life without careful oversight would be irresponsible. So she set boundaries. All contact between Domenico and Chiara had to go through her. No private meetings, no unmonitored phone calls, no surprise visits. These were not arbitrary rules. They were protections, designed to give Chiara the space to decide for herself, at her own pace, whether this man deserved a place in her life. For Chiara, the arrival of Domenico Gigante was unsettling. She had grown up in a household where the roles were clear, where the people around her had proven themselves through years of consistent care and support. This man, calling himself her father, was a stranger. There were no shared memories, no foundation of trust, and so Chiara kept her distance. She was polite but reserved. She gave brief answers to his questions. She postponed meetings. She communicated primarily through her mother. This was not rebellion, it was self-preservation. It was the instinct of a young woman who understood that she did not owe anyone access to her life simply because they claimed a biological connection. But Domenico Gigante did not interpret Chiara's hesitation as reasonable caution. He interpreted it as rejection. And he did not interpret Constance's boundaries as responsible parenting. He interpreted them as obstruction. The warning signs came quickly. He began calling more frequently than necessary, asking questions that went beyond normal concern. Where was Chiara? Who was she with? When would she be home? He demanded specifics about her schedule, her friends, her activities. He wanted updates that went beyond what Constance was willing to provide. And when those updates were not forthcoming, his tone changed. The messages became accusatory. He claimed that Constance was manipulating Chiara, turning her against him, poisoning the relationship before it could even begin. This was not the language of a father seeking to build trust. It was the language of someone who believed that control was his right. The escalation was steady and deliberate. Domenico began flooding Chiara's phone with messages late at night, demanding immediate responses and expressing frustration when she did not reply quickly enough. He pressured her to move their conversations away from platforms that her mother could monitor, to communicate privately, to meet without Constance present. Chiara recognized what was happening. She had grown up in a household where boundaries were respected, where she had been taught to recognize manipulation, where she had been encouraged to speak up when something felt wrong. And so she did. She told her mother. She showed her the messages. She asked for help. And then Domenico Gigante crossed a line that left no room for misinterpretation. He asked Chiara to send him photographs of herself in a swimsuit. The request was inappropriate, predatory, and impossible to justify. Chiara immediately told her mother. Constance acted swiftly and decisively. She confronted Domenico directly. She made it clear that all future communication would be monitored, that there would be no private contact, that any further inappropriate behavior would result in a complete cessation of contact. She did not leave room for negotiation. She did not soften her language. She was protecting her daughter. Domenico's reaction revealed everything. He did not apologize. He did not express remorse. He argued. He insisted that he had a right to a closer relationship with his daughter. He claimed that Constance was overreacting, that she was creating barriers that did not need to exist. He tried to bypass the agreed-upon rules by contacting Chiara directly, sending messages that were increasingly accusatory, increasingly hostile. He blamed Constance. He blamed Chiara. He framed himself as the victim, a father being denied his rightful place in his daughter's life. But what he failed to understand, or perhaps what he simply refused to accept, was that trust is earned, not demanded. And he had not earned it. For Chiara, this was a defining moment. She became more firm in her decision to keep her distance. She refused to meet with Domenico without her mother present. She documented every inappropriate message, every attempt at manipulation, every instance where he tried to push past the boundaries that had been set. She asked her family for support, and they gave it without hesitation. Constance, Glenda, and Michael Watson all understood that this was no longer a case of strained family dynamics. This was a direct threat to Chiara's safety and well-being. And so they tightened the circle. They monitored communication. They reinforced the boundaries. They made it clear that Domenico Gigante would not be given unsupervised access to Chiara, no matter how much he insisted. But Domenico's history suggested that boundaries were not something he respected. They were obstacles to be overcome. And to understand why the Terwilliger family's efforts to protect Chiara would ultimately prove insufficient, it is necessary to look back at the years that preceded this moment, at the pattern of behavior that had been documented, investigated, and repeatedly insufficiently addressed by the criminal justice system. Domenico Gigante's first serious encounter with law enforcement occurred in 2005, when he was arrested on charges of domestic violence. The victim, whose identity was protected under state law, reported being physically harmed during an altercation. The investigation documented injuries consistent with the accusations. Photographs were taken. Medical records were filed. Witness statements were collected. The evidence pointed to a clear pattern of physical aggression, but instead of facing a trial and the possibility of a criminal conviction, Domenico was offered a pre-trial diversion program. The terms were straightforward. Complete a series of counseling sessions, submit to supervision, avoid further legal trouble, and the charges would be dropped. He completed the program. The case was closed, and the opportunity to establish a permanent criminal record that might have influenced future judicial decisions was lost. 3 years later, in 2008, Domenico Gigante was involved in a case that, according to the county sheriff at the time, was one of the most disturbing incidents of animal cruelty the department had ever investigated. The details were horrifying. 2 dogs died as a result of actions that investigators determined to be deliberate, prolonged, and sadistic. The case drew public attention. Animal rights organizations called for serious consequences. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet once again, the punishment fell short of what the severity of the crime seemed to warrant. Domenico Gigante was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and probation. He did not serve time in a correctional facility. He was allowed to remain in his home, maintain his daily routines, and experience only minimal disruption to his life. House arrest by design is a form of punishment that allows the convicted individual to avoid incarceration while still being subject to certain restrictions. But those restrictions are not the same as imprisonment. The individual is monitored, typically through electronic ankle bracelets or scheduled check-ins, but they are not removed from their environment. They can still interact with friends, access the internet, and, in many cases, continue working. For Domenico Gigante, house arrest did not serve as a deterrent. It reinforced a belief that the system was lenient, that consequences could be negotiated, that even serious charges could be managed with the right legal representation and the right narrative. In 2012, Another incident added to his growing file. This time it was a road rage confrontation that escalated into violence. Witnesses reported that Domenico was driving his silver pickup truck recklessly, deliberately creating dangerous situations for other vehicles on the road. The incident culminated in a collision involving two motorcyclists. When one of the motorcyclists followed Domenico to a friend's house to confront him, Domenico emerged holding a machete. He made threats. He displayed the weapon in a manner that left no doubt about his willingness to use it. He was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and reckless endangerment, charges that, under Florida law, could have resulted in significant prison time. But once again, several of the charges were dropped during plea negotiations. Domenico Gigante received another 2-year sentence of house arrest and probation. No prison time, no long-term intervention, no meaningful attempt to address the underlying pattern of escalating aggression. The core issue was never addressed. The system treated each incident as isolated, as a one-time lapse in judgment that could be corrected through short-term monitoring and mandatory courses. But the pattern was clear. Domenico Gigante was not someone who lost control in isolated moments of stress. He was someone who used threats, violence, and intimidation to assert power over others. And each time the system offered leniency, it sent a message that those behaviors could be managed, that the consequences would never be severe enough to force real change. By the early 2000s and 20s, Domenico Gigante's criminal record painted a troubling picture. A history of domestic violence, a conviction for extreme animal cruelty, a violent confrontation involving a weapon. And yet, he had never spent a single day in a state or federal correctional facility. He had never been subjected to the kind of long-term monitoring or psychological intervention that might have identified him as a high-risk individual. And he had never been placed on a registry or watch list that would have alerted future victims or law enforcement agencies to the danger he posed. The system had failed to connect the dots, and that failure would have catastrophic consequences. In late February 2023, Domenico Gigante's behavior shifted in ways that, in hindsight, should have been recognized as the final steps toward violence. He became obsessed with Chiara's daily schedule. He asked repeatedly where she would be, when she would be home, who she would be with. These were not the questions of a concerned father. They were the questions of someone gathering intelligence, building a plan. On February 27th, Chiara stayed home from school due to tonsillitis. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled. Domenico used the situation to intensify his attempts to reach her, calling multiple times, sending messages that demanded detailed updates about her condition, her treatment, her whereabouts. Constance intercepted the messages. She reminded Domenico that all updates would go through her, that he was not to contact Chiara directly, that the boundaries they had set were non-negotiable. On February 28th, around 3 in the afternoon, Domenico called again. Chiara was at an optometrist appointment. She gave a brief response, saying she would get back to him later. What followed was a harsh, offensive message, filled with insults and accusations. Chiara limited further contact to what was absolutely necessary. For Constance, this was the final confirmation. The man claiming to want a relationship with his daughter was now using verbal aggression and manipulation. The hostility was no longer subtle. It was overt, undeniable, and dangerous. Bruce McInnes had lived with Domenico Gigante for nearly 18 years. They shared a home, split expenses, and maintained a relationship that, by all accounts, was functional but not particularly close. Bruce knew Domenico's routines, his moods, his ways of dealing with stress. And so, in late February 2023, when Domenico's behavior began to change, Bruce noticed immediately. Domenico was pacing around the house, muttering to himself, checking his phone obsessively. Everything revolved around one name, Chiara Terwilliger. On February 28th, after sending another unsuccessful message to Chiara, Domenico read the message aloud to Bruce. It was followed by a string of insults aimed at Constance and the rest of the family. And then, suddenly, the anger gave way to a chilling silence. What Domenico said next was not shouted. It was not emotional. It was calm, matter of fact. "Guess I'll have to go take them all out." Bruce froze. This was not the kind of statement that could be dismissed as venting. It was not hyperbole. It was a plan, spoken aloud, without hesitation or doubt. From that moment on, the warning signs came fast. Domenico repeated himself. No one's listening to me. They turned her against me. Something has to be done. He stopped using names and began saying them, which made Bruce wonder if Domenico was thinking beyond just Chiara. The silence between those statements was filled with restless pacing, rereading old messages, and a kind of cold focus that Bruce had never seen before. So why didn't Bruce go to the authorities? He would later tell investigators that he had grown used to that kind of talk. Over the years, Domenico had made bold, angry statements that eventually fizzled out. This felt like more of the same. And there were doubts. What exactly would he report? Who should he warn? Would calling someone trigger an even worse reaction? Bruce decided to wait it out. That evening, Domenico kept saying the same things. She's not answering. They're in the way. This has to end. Bruce tried to get him to focus on something else, to go out, to take a break from the tension. Domenico wasn't interested. He had made up his mind. Only in hindsight did Bruce piece it all together. The short statements, the intensity, the stillness, it was all leading toward something, And Bruce McInnes, the only person who heard those threats, never documented them, never shared them with anyone, never alerted the authorities. He admitted later, I didn't think it would go further than just talk. But it did. And with that missed moment came a tragic truth. By the end of February, a man with a known history of violence was openly talking about his intentions in front of another adult, and no one intervened. By the end of February 2023, any trace of civility in Domenico Gigante's tone had vanished. The pretense of reconciliation gave way to something far more chilling, a clear and growing intent to act. He stopped asking for meetings. He no longer discussed boundaries. His focus shifted entirely toward removing what he now viewed as an obstacle. Signs of planning began to appear. He asked specific questions about Chiara's daily routine, not out of concern, but as data collection. Where she would be, who she would be with, what time she would be home. This was reconnaissance. It was the construction of a blueprint. Constance Terwilliger remained firm. Any communication with Chiara had to go through her and had to be trackable. That position, steady and unwavering, made her the primary focus of Domenico's anger. He began accusing her of manipulating their daughter. His hostility toward the family as a whole escalated quickly. And by the evening of February 28th, all the elements of what would soon become a nightmare were in place. He had rejected any third-party involvement. He had targeted a time of night when the house would be most vulnerable. And he had made it clear, if only to himself, that he was prepared to act alone. No warnings, no witnesses, just intent. Around 1:20 in the morning on March 1st, 2023, the Terwilliger household was asleep. The silence was shattered. First by screaming, then by a rapid series of gunshots, 9 in total. In between, terrified voices could be heard, then a sudden, chilling quiet. The two young boys woke to the sound of chaos. They stepped out of their room and were met with the aftermath. The older brother, 9 years old, grabbed Chiara's phone, opened a video call and reached out to someone he trusted, a family acquaintance named Michael Bishon. Michael Bishon had expected to see Chiara's face on the screen. Instead, he saw 2 frightened boys trying to describe something unimaginable. He reacted instantly. He stayed on the call, speaking calmly, urging the boys to stay in the room, not to move until he arrived. While driving over, he confirmed their address, checking in repeatedly to hear their voices, just enough to know they were still okay. When he arrived, the call was still active. Entering the home, Bishon immediately encountered a horrifying scene. Near the entryway were 2 adults, unresponsive, Constance Terwilliger and Michael Watson. Without hesitating, he went straight upstairs to the children. He gathered them, brought them down carefully and got them into his car, shielding them from seeing any more than they already had. He locked the doors from the inside, checked that the boys were safe and close by, and only then did he make the emergency call. While speaking with the emergency dispatcher, Michael Bishon reported that he had received a video call from a child, arrived at the Terwilliger home, and found multiple unresponsive adults inside. He clarified that the two young boys were safe and with him in his vehicle, and that urgent help was needed immediately. He didn't attempt to assess the condition of the victims further. Time was critical, and he had no intention of re-entering the home. The first patrol units arrived shortly after 2 in the morning. Headlights cut through the dark as law enforcement blocked the street and secured the perimeter. Emergency responders quickly took over. Police, paramedics, and a forensic response team. The street was silent, except for the flicker of emergency lights. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes only after the sirens stopped. The boys were kept warm in a patrol vehicle where a medic and a specialist trained in handling child witnesses provided immediate care. In that moment, their role became central. Their call had triggered the response that prevented the situation from getting worse. Investigators began their sweep of the scene. The front door showed clear signs of forced entry, a broken lock and splintered door frame. On the ground floor, 9 spent shell casings were recovered. Their placement and ballistic paths were carefully marked and logged. The absence of signs of prolonged struggle, along with valuables left untouched, ruled out robbery. This was a targeted attack on the residence. Medical personnel confirmed the fatalities. The initial police assessment recorded gunshot wounds to the heads of Constance Terwilliger and Michael Watson near the entryway. Upstairs, Glenda Terwilliger was found in bed with a gunshot wound to the face. Kiara was discovered separately, her location noted for evidence integrity. The home was divided into zones, and every movement of the investigative team was documented to maintain the chain of custody. At the same time, officers canvassed the neighborhood and began collecting footage from residential and street cameras. Several neighbors pointed to home surveillance systems. Footage from a nearby camera showed a silver pickup truck pulling into the Terwilliger driveway at 1:19 in the morning. Its headlights shut off moments before it came to a stop. The sound of the door being forced open and 9 shots followed over the next 71 seconds. Moments later, the truck pulled away. A different camera on a neighboring street picked up what appeared to be the same silver pickup heading toward the area where Domenico Gigante lived. The forensic team compared the video timeline with physical evidence from the scene. The number of shell casings matched the audio. Bloody shoe prints were documented at the entrance and along the staircase, the pattern suggesting fast, direct movement through the home. Timestamps from all footage were synced with dispatcher logs to eliminate any discrepancies from time zone settings or device clocks. Phones and digital devices were collected from the scene, including the one belonging to Kiara Terwilliger. Call logs and messages were copied to secure storage, with access strictly limited and officially documented. These digital records became crucial in establishing a timeline. The escalation of pressure, the final exchanges, and Kiara's abrupt decision to cut off communication. By midday, investigators had assembled a compelling body of evidence. There was clear forced entry, targeted acts of violence against specific family members, no signs of robbery, synchronized video footage of a silver pickup truck, and a digital trail showing threats and coercion. At the top of the suspect list was Domenico Gigante. He had motive, he had access to personal schedules, and he had a history of escalating conflict with the family. On the morning of March 1st, investigators approached Domenico Gigante using the knock-and-talk method, which does not require a warrant. Parked in front of his residence was a silver pickup matching the description of the vehicle seen on surveillance footage outside the Terwilliger home. When Domenico stepped outside with Bruce McInnes, officers informed him that Kiara Terwilliger was deceased. His reaction, "This is a joke. That can't be true." He didn't ask what happened or request to see his daughter. Showing no visible emotion, he asked for a cigarette and mentioned needing to gather himself because of the dogs. Detectives invited him to come down to the station for a conversation. He agreed without hesitation, but also without expressing any concern about the events. On the ride to the station, he didn't ask about Kiara. He didn't mention the family. Instead, he made small talk. Officers noted the lack of any parent-focused questions or meaningful response to the fact that his daughter had been killed. Before leaving, Bruce McInnes reportedly asked Domenico directly if he had anything to do with what had happened. Domenico responded, "Yeah, I shot her 3 times. Now it's just us. We stick together. We'll get through it." There was no remorse in his voice, no explanation, no regret. Just a strange, almost detached attempt to draw McInnes into his mindset. At the station, during his initial interview, Domenico remained emotionally flat. He didn't request that anyone be contacted on his behalf and showed no interest in the investigation. When asked direct questions, he gave vague answers and repeatedly returned to off-topic subjects. The official report notes a complete lack of natural parental response to the death of a child. What followed was an attempt to shift the blame. While in custody, Domenico Gigante requested a monitored meeting with Bruce McInnes, during which he proposed a so-called solution, that Bruce take the fall for the sake of their friendship. He tried to frame it as a noble act, something that would save them both if Bruce would just go along with his version of events. Bruce refused. Later, he informed investigators of the conversation, quoting Domenico's words exactly. Days later, in a recorded jail phone call, Domenico repeated the same idea. He urged Bruce to confess in his place and brought up the possibility of pleading insanity. These calls, all logged per standard protocol, were added to the case as further evidence of ongoing witness manipulation and attempts to rewrite the narrative. The trial of Domenico Gigante opened with a question of mental competency. His defense argued that he had acted under the influence of a psychological disorder, that he wasn't in control and didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. They called for further psychiatric evaluations and referenced his prior history of aggressive outbursts. The defense's primary objective was to have Gigante declared not criminally responsible by reason of insanity, effectively removing the charge of premeditated murder. But the prosecution countered immediately. From the first hearing, they presented the case as a cold, calculated act, not a moment of madness, but a meticulously planned attack. Throughout the trial, Gigante sat silently. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge the jury. He showed no visible reaction when the victims' names were read aloud. Jurors interpreted his demeanor as total lack of remorse. The prosecutor's final statement proved decisive. He laid out the timeline step by step, detailing each action from the buildup of threats to the execution of the plan. According to the prosecution, everything pointed to one conclusion. This was not a spontaneous act. It was intentional from the start. In closing arguments, the defense reiterated the mental health angle, but court-appointed experts testified that while Gigante did show signs of a personality disorder, it did not impair his ability to understand the nature and consequences of his actions. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence, 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence structured to ensure that Domenico Gigante would never walk free again. As the verdict was read, Domenico Gigante remained completely emotionless. He didn't make a statement. He didn't look at the courtroom. Not a flicker of reaction crossed his face. For the family members present, who stood to hear the judge's final words, it was a solemn confirmation that justice had been served. Even though no verdict could bring back the lives that were lost, the sentencing brought legal closure. The state officially declared Domenico Gigante guilty of a premeditated mass killing and eliminated any possibility of his release. The 2 young boys were placed in the care of extended family. Custody arrangements were handled through state agencies, with involvement from child protection professionals. To shield them from further trauma and unwanted public attention, the boys were relocated to a different, undisclosed location. Their immediate needs became the top priority, ensuring safety, creating a stable daily routine, accessing necessary medical care, and continuing their education. As the only witnesses to the tragedy, the children were interviewed with extreme care, following protocols specifically designed for minors. Trained specialists conducted the sessions gently and methodically, recording vital information without re-traumatizing the boys. All contact with the outside world, including media inquiries, was strictly managed through legal guardians to protect the children from public scrutiny and pressure. This tragedy exposed long-standing failures in the system. Time and again, Domenico Gigante had managed to avoid real consequences. His early acts of violence were treated as isolated incidents, not as parts of a larger, dangerous pattern. The link between cruelty to animals and future harm to people was overlooked. The red flags were there, but no one connected them. For the boys, life after this event isn't a headline. It's a long, painful process of rebuilding. They'll have to relearn how to trust adults, adapt to a new way of living, and find stability in a world that once felt safe and suddenly wasn't. The memory of Glenda, Constance, Kiara Terwilliger, and Michael Watson will always be a part of their story. And the responsibility to learn to change to act rests with the adults, the ones who design the systems, the ones who decide whether the warning signs are taken seriously next time, whether the right words spoken in time might finally be heard.